I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Denise Neal. Dr. Neal has written the museum text for more than 60 works in the JCCC American Indian Art Collection, which ranks among the top contemporary Native art collections in the region. Dr. Neal earned a PhD in Native American art history from the University of Oklahoma in 2017, for which her dissertation was titled Representation and Misrepresentation, Depictions of Native Americans in Oklahoma Post Office Murals. Recently, Dr. Neal curated an exhibition at the Wheelwright Museum in Santa Fe entitled Laughter and Resilience, Humor and Native American Art. Additionally, her research spans the fields of beadwork to contemporary Indigenous painting. Having worked in the museum field for approximately 2 decades, Denise Neal currently serves as Executive Director of the 45th Infantry Division Museum in Oklahoma City. Welcome, Dr. Neal.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. It was my immense pleasure to write on so many works in the Native American Art Collection at the Nerman Museum. And I can tell you that it is a vast and wonderful collection. Bruce and the rest of the staff have put together a really comprehensive and really kind of encyclopedic number of works of art, at least the ones that I worked on. And I think it shows the vast range of Native American art, that Native American art is something that is really fluid and changes and is exciting and dynamic and spans subject matter and media and all kinds of things. And so I learned a lot by working on this project. I have to thank throughout the writing process of working on this, Alice Thorson, who is also very instrumental in giving me advice and offering suggestions for edits and things like that. So where would we be as writers if it wasn't for really good editors as well? And without further ado, I think I'll move on. I'm going to read part of the text as I have written it. And I'm also probably going to interject a little bit about some comments. Having worked on more than 60 pieces of art and writing about them, I had to pare that down a lot to fit into our time frame, and I hope I don't go over. But it was hard to select which pieces to talk about, but I tried to give a range. I think that you'll start to see as I go through the slides some development of themes and ideas that come across. One of the things as an art historian that is odd is we're used to making a lot of compares and contrasts to make points. And in this particular exercise, I was writing singularly about single pieces, but I did bring in a couple of side-by-sides that I thought kind of either matched up with works that were similar to each other in one instance, and another instance where I worked on a couple of works of art by the same artist. So here we'll start, and I brought in a couple of textiles to begin, and I start with Gina Adams, who is Ojibwe, and she did a series of quilts, and this is Broken Treaty Quilt number 7. And so they're really significant and interesting works of art. So Gina Adams has created a series of quilts in which she has incorporated language from treaties between the United States government and Native American tribes. She describes this project as an acknowledgement of the painful moments in so-called modern time when white man broke his promises over and over again to Native Americans. The letters cut out of calico fabric are sewn onto antique quilts, creating a dichotomy between the sadness associated with broken treaties and the comfort connected with quilts. Broken Treaty Quilt 7 depicts an 1867 agreement signed by the Comanche and Arapaho tribes with the government at Medicine Lodge in Kansas. Antagonism between Plains tribes and government escalated after the Civil War, and tribal leaders met with government officials in a hope to put an end to ongoing conflicts. Within a year of signing the historical agreement, payments to tribes were withheld, and General Sherman was working to prevent all Indian hunting rights. The landmark agreement is most remembered for its broken promises. And so I really find this compelling work, this idea of taking something in the past and presenting it in such a unique way is just, I think, genius. And I just can't say enough good things about Gina Adams and her creativity. And a totally different work in the collection, a weaving. This is by fifth generation Navajo weaver Mary Lou Schultz, who uses hand-spun yarn and vegetal and aniline dyes to create her weavings. Sometimes she works with classical Navajo designs, but she also works in contemporary abstracted motifs and non-symmetrical patterns, which is certainly what you have here. And so just a little bit of background, in 1994, the Intel Corporation located in Rio Rancho, New Mexico, commissioned Schultz to weave a replica of a computer circuit board. And in 2008, the Nerman Museum commissioned her to create another computer chip design. Both projects allowed the artist to explore abstract aesthetics. And according to curator Candace Hopkins, the computer chip weavings also recall Navajo women that produced integrated circuit diodes and other computer components for Fairchild Industries, who operated a factory in Shiprock, New Mexico from 1965 to 1975. This would be the area where Schultz is from. Marketing materials for the firm noted a correlation between the aesthetics of geometric patterns emulating a circuit board, which are, in this case, are woven in shades of blue, green, red, and gray. The subtle gradations of the palette merge to create an intricate design, transforming the image of circuits into an abstract work of art. And so I think that interesting for me is this idea of commissions and what artists do. If you run the gamut of representation of your culture and you do Navajo weavings and then someone says, hey, this is like a computer chip, will you do this? Will you make this thing? And I think that she did just a phenomenal job of depicting something that I think if you know this background story, you can start to see circuit boards appear. And I think that before I go on, I want to say, because I'm going to switch from textiles to pottery, is part of the approach of how I worked on this project. And the Nerman gave me a lot of leeway. They didn't, other than saying they needed to be 200 words, they didn't say I had to approach it one way or the other. And so in some instances, if it's painting, I really looked at iconography. In other instances, I might have paid attention to the techniques that are used to produce a work of art, or the particular materials that are used, or something like that. So from that perspective, I think that all art historians, you can't approach every piece exactly the same way, and having that freedom to, approach these works differently, as I decided the kind of the key things to point out in just a few scant 200 words was really liberating in some ways and challenging in others. So pottery, I think, is something that we all think about really frequently when it comes to Native American art. And sometimes we think of very, I guess, traditional, for lack of a better word, pieces. And so we see that here in a work by Grace Chino from Acoma Pueblo. And she's from an important family of innovative Acoma potters, including her mother, Marie, her sisters, Carrie, Vera, and Rose. And I think that that's something that we see in these works of art, is sometimes it is the knowledge of producing pieces that are transferred down through family lines. And sometimes I've worked on artists in the collection at the Nerman that have went to, gotten master's degrees in fine arts, and they have a very different view sometimes of how they produce art. And some of the artists are simply self-taught. So using native clay, timber, slips, and paints, her work is widely acclaimed for the consistent wall thickness of her carefully formed vessels and her designs, which were painted with the utmost of care. This example is a seed pot, which although now produced as a decorative form, was originally designed to protect seeds from rodents and insects. And you can see how the design would protect seeds because the hole in the top is very small, although this is larger than a traditional seed pot might be. And of her work, Chino once stated, quote, "Each pot should decide which design is appropriate." And I think that the design here works really well. So she painted the pot in orange, black, and white. And these would have been colors that had been used at Acoma through the years. And interestingly, these kind of wonderful geometric patterns are actually 4-petal flower motifs joined together to form repeated circular patterns, which interlace with parallel lines of white and black. The decoration diminishes in size as it spirals toward the top and bottom of the pot, creating a dynamic sense of movement. The complexity of the design is engaging and allows the viewer to explore an optical illusion that it creates. And I think that you see this when you look at Puebloan pottery that focuses on these kind of wonderful geometric patterns that are repetitive, is it almost just draws your eye in and you can't look away. It almost starts to swirl as you look at the patterns. And so really impressive work when you think of the skill that it takes to lay down that many kind of concise lines and patterns. But I wanted to talk also about another Acoma pot to show kind of the diversity even within one pueblo. So this work is by Shatesa White Dove, who is from Acoma, and she was inspired to do work by her grandmother, who was a potter, Connie O. Serna. And she started doing pottery in 1984. And like Chino, she also uses natural clay found at Acoma. And I didn't mention earlier, but it has a very light quality property, and it allows for very thin walls on the pottery, but when it's fired, it becomes very durable. So it's stronger despite its very thin kind of appearance. So specializing in polychrome designs, this pot is one of her favorite subjects. White Dove has painted her motifs in orange, brick red, and black on a field of avocado green. Her designs combine geometric and curvilinear patterns. The inclusion of parrots depicted on Southwest pottery finds its roots in ancient Mimbres culture. Some anthropologists believe that the people of Acoma and also Laguna were the descendants of this pre-contact culture. Parrots, of course, are not indigenous to New Mexico, but we do know that they were revered by the Mimbres people who traded for the exotic birds with the tribes of Mesoamerica. Archaeological evidence suggests that parrots and macaws were used for ceremonial purposes, and the importance of the tropical birds is carried on in their representation in this Acoma pot. And I wanted to talk about kind of a divergent with Pueblo and pottery. And so these are very different, although using methods that would be used by any other Pueblo and pottery using kind of traditional techniques. But this is Jason Garcia, who's also from a family of Santa Clara Pueblo potters. And I think that's just something that runs throughout the Pueblos is carrying on traditions, but he does some really different things. So despite gathering native clay and using organic slips and outdoor firing techniques, he transforms the conventional by painting his tiles with innovative non-traditional designs. He made his first graphic tile in 2002, which solidified his place within contemporary Pueblo potters. Garcia's clay tiles often depict the intersection between Puebloan culture and modern society. His imagery frequently includes references to comic book superheroes, video game characters, and pop culture icons. Tiles from his Grand Theft Auto series, as seen here, blend illustrations from the cover art for the video games with scenes of Pueblo life, deftly joining worlds that may, to outsiders, seem unrelated. The figures wearing traditional regalia are depicted in a Pueblo village. By blending traditional and contemporary imagery such as cars and motorcycles, Garcia's work counters stereotypical images of a romanticized past, but they are active participants in contemporary society. I'm just a huge fan of Jason's work. He had a pot that featured G.I. Joe that is also phenomenal, not in the Nerman collection, but if you have a chance to see it, it's grand. Diego Romero, there were actually 3 works by Diego on my list that I wrote about, and I've included here because I think that they show kind of an interesting difference in subject matter. And Diego's really interesting. He's from Cochiti, Pueblo, and he works in printmaking and in pottery. And a lot of times those images are the same, but produced in different mediums. And so I think that makes it really interesting. So the figure, the pot on the left, or the bowl on the left, is called Dancing Coyotes. It's from 2007, and it's a figure that Romero has turned to repeatedly during his career. And his representation of this Native American trickster is reminiscent, actually, of the block-like style, artistic style of the American artist Keith Haring. And although Romero's depictions of coyotes sometimes reflect tricksters' negative influences on Native culture, to include things like too much drinking, these playful dancing figures are definitely reminiscent of the playful works of Haring. So it's interesting how he draws them or paints them into the pottery, which, you definitely see animal figures. There's these kind of protruding tongues that come from elongated snouts and pointed ears that identify them as animals, but they certainly have human characteristics as they frolic across the dance floor. And I think too, so they're kind of a anthropomorphized kind of representation here. So they kind of have a cartoon-like character in the scene as they dance across the floor. But I think that it's important to look at the checkerboard decoration that he uses on the rim of the bowl and the black and white palette of the piece itself, both of which are also references again to the Mimbres culture. And so if you look at Mimbres pottery, you'll see the checkerboard design pop up, and certainly the black and white color palette as well. And so on the left, I think a very different image compared to kind of these fun coyotes. And this is Fallen Angel 3. And it's a theme that reverberates in multiple works in prints and in his pottery. So he painted the interior of the ceramic bowl with a depiction of Native American man with angel's wings. Romero, like many contemporary indigenous artists, blend the aesthetics of his Cochiti heritage with important commentary on social issues facing Native American communities. The figure in the scene has fallen from grace. There's a liquor bottle placed at his feet, labeled with a skull and crossbones. He rests his elbows on his knees. His head is held by the clenched fist resting against his cheeks. Celestial forms float above in a nighttime sky, and he occupies a barren, desert-looking landscape. The scene is a powerful reminder of the persistence of alcoholism that plagues Indigenous communities. Surrounding the narrative description, again, we get repeated floral motifs that give way to that checkerboard pattern. And both of those, again, are references to Mimbres as well as Cochiti pottery. And glasswork, there's, I did a couple of glasswork essays for the collection, and I decided to talk about one here because I had to pick and choose, which again was really hard, but I decided to deal with Preston Singletary here, who is a Tlingit artist. And it makes sense that a Northwest Coast artist, where glasswork is a really popular medium, that he would want to take that kind of Northwest Coast imagery and that kind of iconography, but turn it into something different and use glass. So here he has formed the work by layering black over red glass title of the work, I think, is interesting. It's Raven Steals the Moon, and it's a sand-carved formline representation of Raven, who is an important character in Northwest Coast mythology. And I think that normally when we think of formline, we might think of drawings or Chilcut weavings, or certainly wood carvings come to mind. But here he's given us Raven in glass. So Raven was responsible for creating the trees, animals, and men, but the earth remained in darkness. And the trickster Raven learned that a chief possessed light, which he had hidden away in a series of carved cedar boxes. He decided to turn himself into a grandchild of the chief in order to steal the light. Raven begged his grandfather to allow him to open the boxes, and each time the old man yielded to his request. When Raven finally saw the light, he grabbed it in his beak and flew away from the house. Raven, like all tricksters, are in indigenous mythologies, are often a victim of their own hubris. And in his escape, he was seen by Eagle, who attempted to steal the light, causing Raven to drop some of it, and it became the moon and the stars. And so this idea of kind of folklore stories within a culture being told in this kind of wonderful glass art is really fabulous. And so I decided to bring up a couple of paintings, 3 paintings actually, that I worked on. And this one is really interesting for me. It was a hard one to write because it took some outside research that was took a little sleuthing, but it's called Assassination. It's by a Choctaw artist named Valjean Hessing. And her art frequently addresses Choctaw history, including themes such as removal to Indian territory. And her somber imagery is often set in a bleak landscape, and the palette of her paintings uses subtle muted earth tones, which I think works really well in kind of these themes that she engages with her painting. And so here's not a removal painting, but a very interesting work of art. And she depicts a dark moment in Choctaw history, which is the assassination of Chief Red Shoes, who's a Choctaw chief. And most of what we know about him comes from written documents by the French, who actually were the ones that granted him chief status for fighting with them against the Chickasaw. But by March of 1746, Red Shoes was facing opposition from his own tribe and from the French. He had gone back and forth between siding with the English and siding with the French, and that didn't make people too happy. And it actually led to the planning of his assassination, which was actually carried out by other Choctaw tribal members. So the coup was planned, and it was they were going to kill Red Shoes plus 2 of his, followers, and that's what is depicted here. And so in my research, I couldn't necessarily determine which figure was Red Shoes. One would think, maybe being the primary protagonist in the story, that it would be the figure in the front that's getting ready to be clubbed. But as you can see, if you look closely, there's another person in the back raising a knife, getting ready to assassinate someone. And there's a figure already lying on the ground that is actually either wounded or dying. And so you might wonder, how did I figure all of this out? Well, I've got to say, I didn't figure it all out on my own. I had to reach out to a lot of my Native American friends and colleagues for advice, and eventually was put in touch with Sharon Autun Harjo, who's a painter and a friend of Valjean's, who had first-hand knowledge of the work of art and direct communication with the artist about its meaning. And so it really goes to show you that sometimes in art history, the kind of links that you get to go to where there isn't something specifically written on a work of art, so you have to try to find somebody with that knowledge, because I think that a lot of times as art historians, we can project what we think is happening in a painting, but it's always better to get a primary or at least a secondary source that has direct knowledge. The other difficulty in this work of art was the 200-word constraint in this instance, because this is clearly an image that you could write, an entire paper on. So I wanted to show this as kind of how we might think about Native American representations in one sense, but then there's of course a shift in Native American painting. And I think, well, it doesn't start with Fritz Scholder. Certainly Oscar Howe and other people were doing contemporary modernist kind of paintings early on, with someone like Howe doing works as early in the 1950s that were really influenced by Western modernism. But this is Fritz Scholder, and he's certainly one of the most well-known of the artists that started to move away from the imagery of indigenous representation that had been part of Native American painting for a very long time. So he became known as a leader of New American Indian art movement, and he influenced generations of Native American artists. Heavily influenced by his studies with artists Wayne Thiebaud and Raymond Witt, Blessed Indian relies on a modernist aesthetic that includes abstraction, bold brushstrokes, and a bright palette. In this painting, Scholder's subject holds a peace pipe in his left hand, and there's a quilled or beaded bag that hangs from his left wrist, and he wears a hair pipe choker around his neck. Well, these accoutrements certainly identify him as an indigenous man. His abstracted facial features, painted in shades of orange, lavender, magenta, and turquoise, demonstrate the influences of contemporary Western art. The iconography of a Plains Indian headdress, so typical of indigenous representation, has given way to radiating lines of orange and black that burst from his teal blue hair. Of his art, Scholder stated, quote, "My work startled many people because I, part Indian, treated the Indian differently, not as the noble savage endlessly portrayed by white painters, and also because my technique was non-Indian." So Scholder certainly is an important artist within the canon of Native American painting, and I think very influential. And then this work, which is very recent, 2020 work by Deani Whitehawk, who is Lakota. And this work is untitled, and it's called All the Colors. And she is a very hot artist right now, to say the least. She's getting lots of recognition that is so very well deserved. And she's an interesting background. So she was drawn to art at a really young age, yet she knew little about the art of her own indigenous heritage until she was in her teens. The exploration of her own cultural identity shaped her art in compelling ways. She has stated, quote, "My work embraces the dilemmas and contradictions, as well as the joys and blessings of a cross-cultural existence. As a woman of Lakota and European ancestry, my life experiences have been a combination of Western and indigenous education. My artwork examines, dissects, and patches back together pieces of each in a means to provide an honest representation of self and culture." In this untitled mixed media work, Whitehawk's artistic philosophy is clearly on display as she blends historical influence with contemporary aesthetic. The minimalist monochromatic background is a subtle backdrop for the colorful geometric bands of glass bugle beads sewn onto this large 4 by 4 foot canvas, creating an abstract array of color. The use of glass beads is certainly a homage to Lakota ceremonial clothing, yet she has moved that medium into an entirely contemporary direction. White Hawk's art emerges from the perspective of self-acceptance, and it invites us to understand her process of a blending of Indigenous and contemporary art. And it will say right here, this thought of who is Indian, who creates Native art is really interesting. And I know for myself, being in Delaware and Cherokee, but not really not growing up in my culture, I had to learn as I got older about my culture. And I think that's what happens with White Hawk as well, is that she's raised in an environment and has to go out and seek this knowledge. And so, I think that it's one of the things that makes Native art kind of wonderful and diverse in that way. So jewelry, gosh, you could talk about jewelry for an awful long time, and I certainly didn't bring in every piece of jewelry that I wrote about, but I thought that it would be beneficial to talk about the work by Charles Loloma because he is so incredibly influential for jewelry in the Southwest and what Native American jewelry should be. So Charles Loloma was a traditional Hopi man, but his jewelry was always on the cutting edge. This brooch is a minimalist and contemporary in design. Slightly curved horizontal silver bars flare outward, and the bottom bar is adorned with ironwood inlay. And the slender silver drop is embellished with a piece of red coral at the bottom. Loloma's wearable art was sometimes criticized for not conforming to the aesthetic associated with Native American jewelry in the Southwest. Rather than be deterred by his detractors, he remained steadfast in his dedication to innovative designs and the use of a wide array of stones. Loloma expressed strong feelings about the materials he worked with and wrote that I felt a strong kinship to stones, not just the precious and semi-precious stones I use in my jewelry, but the humble stones I pick up at random while hiking through the hills or walking along the beach. I feel the stone and I think not to conquer it, but to help it express itself. Loloma's innovative jewelry making continues to influence contemporary Native American jewelry artists today. And so very important and influential artist. Certainly, I think a lot of times we think about his work in pins and rings and brooches that have a lot of inlaid stones. But I think this particular piece from 1965 just screams kind of the minimalist kind of beauty that he could accomplish in this work. And I wanted to switch gears for just a minute as I thought about Loloma and talk about a work that I worked on, sorry, my phone is ringing, sorry. A work that, I'm gonna move just that down, by Ken Williams he was iconic from 2014. And Ken is really interesting, and I had the pleasure of working with Ken because in addition to being an artist, he also runs the gift shop at the Wheelwright Museum of Art. And when I was at the Wheelwright doing the exhibition that I was doing there, I got to talk to him in person about this work while I was getting ready to write it, which is always helpful. And I think one of the things that sometimes I would reach out to artists, sometimes I would do separate research, sometimes I would be at a loss and really take into consideration my art historical training and write. But Ken was instrumental in my being able to really grasp the importance of this work. So it pays tribute to one of Williams's idol, who is Charles Loloma. And out of respect for the artist, he actually sought permission from the family before taking on the project. The front of the bag features a beaded portrait of Loloma seated at his workbench. The likeness to the artist created using a single stitch bead work technique and is a highly accurate depiction of Loloma. Next to him is his signature, Loloma, which goes down the side of the piece. Very iconic signature that he had there. And it's set against a swirling curvilinear patterns in purple seed beads, Loloma's favorite color. The backside of the bag is adorned with figural images inspired by the jewelry maker's designs. beaded on rain tanned smoked deer hide. Williams follows in the footsteps of Loloma, using only the finest materials to embellish this bag, which includes freshwater pearls, 14-karat gold beads, lapis, and merino wool. In every aspect of design and construction, this work really is a homage to Loloma. And Richard Chavez, another really interesting artist who works in a very contemporary way. And so he's from San Felipe Pueblo. And in the early 70s, he actually worked as an architectural draftsman for Harvey S. Hoschauer, who actually worked for the Bauhaus architect Mies van der Rohe. And if you know much about Bauhaus, the philosophy emphasized principles of purity, sparseness, and balance. And I think that you can see that these things found their way into Chavez's jewelry. Known for fine lapidary work, collectors of his jewelry appreciate his dramatic styling and pristine craftsmanship. From start to finish, each piece of jewelry involves a number of steps, beginning with sketches to determine design as well as production methods. And I think Chavez is interesting because I think he moves away from some of the ways that Native American artists actually approach the Indian art market. And so he stopped showing at and entering juried competitions in 1990 because he didn't feel the need to have that kind of competitive validation, which shows an artist that was really became sure of himself and his abilities. And so instead he found the positive reactions and comments from the public and his clientele to be more gratifying than any award that he could possibly receive. And this work is just really stunning. It is, the stones are something that I'm just impressed with every time that I look at it, this wonderful kind of inlay work and the subtleties of that coral and the turquoise is really quite phenomenal. And I wanted to bring in something more traditional before I stop talking about jewelry, but also a comparative of squash blossom necklaces, both by Native American women from Zuni Pueblo. And so the one on the left is Litzalitza Simplistico, and the work is I think pretty indicative of the time period that it was created. It's 1930 to 1949, so a pretty broad range of dates. But the use of silver and the beadwork and the cabochons of turquoise really interesting. And we don't really think about women being working in lapidary to cut stones or to do silver work, but at Zuni, they were working to make jewelry as early as in the early opening decades of the 20th century. And so I think a very interesting comparison, though, from the 1973 necklace by Edith Sabasea, who is very famous for her needlepoint turquoise work. And so tremendous lapidary skills. And she made her first cluster work necklace in 1962 and developed a highly distinctive style of needlepoint cluster work with raised curved turquoise stones, silver squash blossoms project from roundels of Sleeping Beauty turquoise. The precisely cut needlepoint stones encircle smaller round cut gems. At the center of each cluster is a pear-shaped cabochon. And the Naja pendant repeats the use of the needlepoint and the sphere-cut stones. An additional drop dangles from the center of the Naja, which is not something that you normally see in a squash blossom necklace. She's incorporated a really large amount of turquoise in this work, but there's something about the needlepoint that gives it a delicacy that makes it more it feels lighter despite all of the turquoise that is used. And it's probably hard to see that in the photographs compared to if you actually get to look at one of her works. I actually own a ring by her, And it is that needlepoint kind of fine turquoise that is just so delicate and wonderful, and honestly a little fragile, and scares me every time I wear that ring. So one more interesting piece I wanted to talk. I'm a sucker for beadwork, so I wanted to talk about Marcus Amerman and this bolo tie with a depiction of Barack Obama. So the Choctaw artist Marcus Amerman finds his inspiration from a wide range of influences, including beadwork, that it was part of the tradition of his own family, but he's also influenced by Plateau region of bead artists that he met when he moved to the Pacific Northwest coast. Amerman began beading at age 10, but has taken the bead artistry into very many new directions. Implementing a single stitch technique, he creates realistic pictorial images. His work is strikingly original, and his imagery ranges from pulp culture to social commentary. So here, he's been inspired by Shepard Fairey's now famous Hope poster, which was created in the 2008 presidential election, and used it to recreate Fairey's stylized portrait of Barack Obama. So concentric circles of the single stitch beadwork radiate across the tie's slide. Subtle color shift of red to light blue to navy blue to white, which create a recognizable depiction of the 44th president of the United States. The tips of the braided leather cord are interesting because they're decorated in a different style of beadwork, the gourd stitch, which is more reminiscent of the technique used by the artist family. So a Choctaw kind of influence there, but I think you can see in pictorial beadworks, Amerman is just absolutely fantastic, as are a lot of other artists who have elected to kind of go away from the geometrics or abstracts of beadwork and take on these kind of portraits within their works of art. And I think when we think about Native American art, sometimes people think of cradle boards, but a lot of times when I think of cradle boards, I think of Oklahoma cradle boards, the kind of heavily beaded, beautiful work done by the Comanche and the Kiowa. But this work is by the Mohawk artist, Donald Babe Hemlock, who was actually born in Brooklyn, New York. He's the son of a fourth generation iron worker. Many Mohawk men working in construction helped to shape the city's iconic skyline. And Hemlock's family returned to the Mohawk Reservation when he was 2 and brought him closer to his own indigenous heritage, including exposure to wooden cradle boards made for Mohawk children. Yet his paintings on these works of art are not traditional at all. In New York Times, he depicts a cityscape which pays homage to his family's connection to the city, while addressing stereotypes about Indigenous people. Hemlock's contemporary urban scene removes Indigenous cultures from a romanticized past and shows their contributions to modern life. In this image, the artist depicts an iron worker sitting on a steel beam high above the New York Times sign. And then juxtaposed to the image of the construction worker is a banner depicting the Lone Ranger and Tonto. Their inclusion reinforces Hemlock's statements on stereotypes perpetuated by pop culture, which included the 2013 movie, The Lone Ranger. And if you can see that in the detail on the right is, you can see that banner of that kind of iconic imagery from that movie. And there were several basket weavings that were part of the collection that I wrote on, and I just brought in one here. And I find weaving a really complex and interesting topic. And so this is Elsie Holiday, who's Navajo, and this is Changing Woman basket that was made in 2008. And I think it's important to note, and it's one of the places I wanted to talk about technique when I was writing, was the idea of making baskets, because there's a whole lot to go into basket making, even before you can begin the weaving. And so Elsie Holiday hand gathers the sumac that she uses in her basket along waterways in the Four Corners region of the Navajo Reservation. Preparing the sumac requires stripping of the bark and splitting of the reeds. She dyes her materials in a wide array of colors, and the extensive palette allows her to create intricate designs. Geometric patterns are common among Navajo weavers, but Holiday frequently includes pictorial imagery. Holiday's weaving skills are evident in this basket tray, which depicts a Navajo deity of changing woman, which is a central character in the Navajo creation story. At the center of the basket, Holiday's weaving includes a highly abstracted facial features, and the deity's black hair arches across the composition. The turquoise flame pattern outlined in red represents a ray of light emanating from her head. The repeating swirling patterns of the design provides a rhythmic sense of movement. Together, these elements create a vividly colored and complex weaving. And the coiling technique here is just superb. It's tight and wonderful and allows for this kind of imagery to be used. Wonderful basket tray. And I can't say enough about this. When they sent me this came late in my writing for the project, and I just nearly flipped out. It was the most gorgeous mask that I think I have ever seen. And so this is George Hunt Jr., and he creates a lot of work in a lot of various media, and which includes refined wood carving demonstrated in Supernatural Bumblebee. So he is Kowalke. I am sorry. Every time I try to pronounce it, I butcher it. And he's from the Pacific Northwest. And normally we think of mask being a common art form that's created by these tribes. And in the Northwest Coast in Canada, they've carved, danced, and treasured masks since time immemorial. Masks were constructed using natural resources available to them, including red cedar, feathers, fur, and abalone shell. Symbolism in these carved images is intricately connected to their clan-based societies. Masks often depict animals and birds as well as human faces. And here, less common are insects, including a bumblebee, but there is a bumblebee mask and that this is based on. And so among the bumblebee mask features are sharp barbs reminiscent of the bee's pain-inflicting capability. In this mask, the artist has induced eyes of copper inlaid with abalone shell. The traditional cedar bark hair has been replaced with rabbit fur and feathers. During the potlatch ceremonies, dancers who would wear the bumblebee mask would often sting participants with barbed protrusions emanating from their ceremonial face covering. Dynamic and symbolic, Hunt relies on traditional forms for inspiration. The addition of the highly detailed carved bumblebee enhances the sculptural quality of this work of art. And so in this work, he's taking an art form that we associate with Northwest Coast and elevating it to this kind of sculptural work of art. And I think that it is just one of the most phenomenal pieces that I've ever written about. And another mask, and I think really important, is the thoughts of how the art world has been affected by COVID-19. And this is Leith Makewa, who entitled this work, "I'm Protecting You from Me." And so this is from 2020, very contemporary to our times. And the effects of COVID-19 virus disrupted the art world, and this mask was submitted for an online Indigenous art competition hosted by First American Art Magazine. It was judged as a first place winner. "I Am Protecting You from Me" implements raised beadwork style that finds its roots in Makewa's Oneida heritage. In her most recent creations, she's often relied on monochromatic color schemes, which is evident in this mask. But the floral designs call to mind the beauty of the natural world, but this face covering has a more profound meaning. Of this work, she has stated, quote, "The red glass beads represent the blood that flows through all of us, the commonality that connects humans around the world. The design reflects how our breath flows out into creation and how we are connected to the environment. The black cotton velvet was selected to acknowledge all of those whose lives were taken due to COVID-19. Masks keep us safe and are a reminder to make sure that we think about our actions and how they affect everyone. In acknowledging the importance of this crucial moment in time, she says, let us all strive to be kind, respectful, loving, and supportive to ourselves and those who we often take for granted. And I had the pleasure of being one of the people that got to judge this online Indigenous art competition. And I will say it was my #1 pick. And I just think it is a glorious mask. And I really admire the Nerman for getting this work of art into their collection, because I think not only is it a lovely work of art, but it is so important that it documents the times that we live in. So Kevin Poyer, really interesting artist, Oglala Lakota, and he's a contemporary artist who combines essential elements of his Oglala Lakota heritage with his desire to ensure that Indigenous people are visible as part of modern society. Sunglasses kind of provide a great avenue for this expression. Poyer's artistic medium of buffalo horn is definitely unique. Historically, for the Lakota people, the buffalo was an integral part of their survival. They utilized every part of the animal, and Poyer has stated that a buffalo's spirit resides in the horn cap, the material that forms the foundation of these frames. Yet even the procurement of buffalo horns is not easy. Perhaps this is why he is the only artist that is actually working in this medium at this point. So not only is he using buffalo horn, but the intricate inlaid designs can also be traced to his Lakota heritage. The pale yellow and vibrant red sandstone used for the inlay is gathered from the locations significant to the Lakota people. The abstract geometric patterns that embellish warrior shades are inspired by quill work and beadwork that adorns ceremonial clothing, as well as parfleche bags. And Terry Greaves, again, I can't keep from showing more beadwork. And so these were the first shoes that Terry Greaves actually beaded after the death of her mother, Jerry Apahill. And the figures on the sides of these shoes represent two of the Kiowa's most important female beings. The first is Spider Woman, who survived the flood as recounted in Kiowa oral history. She was a grandmother who raised the sacred Sun Boys and the creator of the first lullaby. Greaves has stated to me in an interview that it is a song my grandmother sang to my mother and my mother sang to me. I breathed life into my sons. The second figure is the mother, a human woman who was the wife of the sun and the mother of the sacred Sun Boys. She is a mother who sacrificed her life so her child would know and should know and serve his people. These shoes honor Kiowa tradition and pay tribute to the artist's mother. Greaves reflects on the importance of her mother when she told me she was a woman that created me, nurtured me, and raised me into the human being that I am today. The woman that is my blood linked to all those Kiowa women that came before me and to help create this world that I was born into. So I think when we look at these, sometimes it's easy to see whimsy because of these kind of wonderful high-heeled tennis shoes, but they are really filled with deep meaning and important for her personally and important for an expression of her Kiowa heritage for certain. And another beadwork piece. This is Jackie Larson Bread, and she was born and raised on the Blackfeet Reservation in Browning, Montana. Formerly trained as a painter, her work has influenced the development of pictorial beadwork, which I mentioned when we were talking about Marcus Amerman as well as Ken Williams. But just to give you a little bit more information of what I mean when I say pictorial beadwork, it's a technique that utilizes graduated shades of glass beads to create realistic depictions. And Bread hand draws her images before beading them onto utilitarian objects. And I think certainly you can see that maybe I was just drawn to these also because they take everyday objects and they make them into something beautiful, whether it's making a pair of sunglasses or, embellishing a laptop case. And so this is called Cover of the Rolling Stone, which is a similar example of her blending past and present. She has stated, quote, "I love taking non-traditional items and embellishing them with a somewhat traditional design. This work includes references to the Blackfeet language. The words on the front translate to turn over or over rock, or in other words, the rolling stone. The word turtle refers to the portrait of a man who becomes a Blackfeet icon in this piece, much like the musicians that grace the cover of the Rolling Stone magazine. And Nepean Studio is a reference to the artist's name in her native language. The blue lane stitch beadwork is historically associated with traditional beadwork of the artist's tribe, and the red stripes symbolizing wind moving across the prairie. Blue dots represent fallen stars. And the back of the sleeve is just as wonderful as the front and is painted in a very geometric parfleche design that would have been used by the Blackfeet people. And Raven Half Moon, I was not overly familiar with Raven's work when I started on this project, but I learned a lot. And she is an artist that I was able to reach out to and talk with. And so she does these really wonderful large scale ceramic sculptures, which relate both to her tribal identity and her experience as a contemporary artist. And she's informed by the pottery traditions of her tribe, but also finds inspiration in things like the Olmec heads of Mexico or the giant carvings of Easter Island. So she's looking at a wide array of works to inform her own artistic sensibility. So here, one way she addresses Caddo practices is through the face painting that's included. And it's interesting how the face is painted, but it gives way to these uneven lines that run across her lips and down to her breast, which she says signifies wounds, war, blood, and earth. Half Moon's sculpting technique is gestural and organic. As she layers rounded forms of clay, her thumbprints leave a patterned texture, and she has stated that, "I enjoy seeing the human touch experience in my work. I want my viewers to see where I have manipulated and pushed the clay. I want them to feel the energy and physicality of the clay and ceramics as a material. I do not want my sculptures to look like a machine made them. They are meant to be powerful, emotional, and experienced." And I've not looked at her work in person, but I very much would love to see the work so I can get kind of that textural feeling that you get even from the imagery here, which I think is really accentuated kind of by this red-white dichotomy that you get in the way that she's applied the glaze. And finally, one last work, and I included Holly Wilson in this because I think her work is really unique in what I've seen of the Nerman's Native American collection. And this is called How Much More Must She Bear, which was actually another artist that I got to reach out to her and talk with her about. And she said it was inspired by a conversation she had with her children in which they described their friends in odd but very specific ways. One was called The Girl with the Yellow Hair or The Boy with Brown Skin. According to Wilson, there was no malice in this odd descriptive manner. The conversation made her think and reflect on how we see people as we grow older. Wilson has stated that, quote, "The bear girls that she represents in this piece of art do not see the color of each other's skin or the limitations that have been placed upon them because they are of who they are or where they are from." Wilson used her skills as a sculptor to produce this work, but rather than using cast figures in bronze, each of the bear women were cast into a silicone mold using melted Crayola crayons. Wilson selected crayons because of their association with their childlike innocence. As we reflect, children are not born with an innate formation of racial and ethnic difference. It is a learned social phenomena. The bears cast a wide array of colors and represent the innocence with which children view the world. And so I find this really interesting. And Holly is a really interesting artist. And I think that just by going through these 24 or so slides that I presented today, I think you can see the wonderful way in which the NERMIT has collected a wide array of art from a very diverse group of artists and representing some of the most contemporary works and artists out there. And I can't commend them enough. And I can't state enough how lucky I was to write on works of art in the collection. So with that, I'm done with my formal presentation and we can open it up to questions.
Okay, well, we have one question that's come in so far, and this person is asking about stylistic movements and how in art history we often have a group of artists who are in one movement and they're kind of responding or rejecting another movement. And she's wondering if any of the artists that you discussed were part of a named or recognized movement within Native American artists, and if so, were there other Native artists who rejected that movement?
I think that you can say that that is true. I don't think that in an art historical kind of canon, the way we think of Western art and Western art movements, I don't necessarily think of Native art as having those same kind of categories. But certainly if you look at someone like Fritz Schulder, you start to see a move away from where art had been that flat style painting that developed in Oklahoma and New Mexico and dominated the Indian art market for a very long time. And it finally takes someone like Oscar Howe to say, no, we don't have to do this. And that by the time you get to Fritz Schulder, he's saying, no, we're not going to do that. And so I think that there was an acceptance and to look at Western art as an influence and to take it and associate it with their own tribal identities a lot of times. I wouldn't say that necessarily those artists always identified with a specific style that associated with a Western canon, but they're certainly being influenced by it. And then I would say in the rejection, a lot of times I would say it's the Native American art market that would reject those kind of changes, sometimes more than the artist. I know during the Philbrook annuals, kind of annual art exhibit held in Tulsa every year, the artists that wanted to break away from that flat style of painting had to fight for their right to show, and they were rejected. And I think then the other example I think that we talked about in this presentation would be Charles Lolema, who starts seeing art, his jewelry as kind of wearable art and breaks away from that kind of, I guess, for lack of a better word, traditional art. And again, part of that is art market. And so the rejection doesn't seem to be so much internal within tribal people saying, no, you shouldn't do that, as much as external forces of the market, I think.
Okay, and we have another question that's just come in. Have you seen non-Native artists who have been influenced by Native artists, kind of the reversal?
If I can ever think of Western, I'm sure there are good examples, particularly maybe in painting, but nothing really comes to mind, but it makes me want to look and think about how that might work and how outside artists, and would the outside artists, the non-Native artist, if they adopted an artistic style associated with a Native American artist, would that be seen as being not an appropriate thing, because it would be looked at as cultural appropriation? So it may not happen very often because of the ideas of cultural appropriation. There was a case, and the artist totally escapes my mind, that had referenced maybe Norval Morrisseau type imagery a year or so ago. And I cannot remember her name to save my soul, but it seems like that got a lot of pushback from communities that, you know, you didn't have the rights to adopt this type of imagery, whether it's stylistically, and certainly I would discourage any non-Native artists from taking cultural iconography and trying to make it their own, because that would be inappropriate.
And a follow-up question to the first one that I asked you is, can you describe just a bit more what you mean by flat style?
Oh, sure. So flat style develops Mostly it starts in Oklahoma in the 1920s, among the Kiowa artists, known as the Kiowa Five, who actually came from Anadarko, came up to the University of Oklahoma and studied with Oscar Howe. Um, and he was very adamant that they make sure they take this style and leave it the same. And so the flat style would be, you have uh, uh, figures, dancing figures, particularly of Kiowa ceremonial or dancing figures, without any background at all. Sometimes when you get into other Oklahoma tribes and you look at the work of early work by someone like Woody Crumbo, there's a little bit of landscape, but they're really quite flat. There's not a lot of depth of field. There's not a lot of background. So they kind of sit very flat against the canvas. So that's where the term flat style kind of originates from.
Would you say that Val Jean Hessing's work that you showed is somewhat in that vein?
Absolutely. So she's very much being inspired by that style. And so that's really late for that style. But I think for her, it was a style that she felt comfortable. She had gone to school at Bacone College. And at Bacone, there were a lot of students that continued to work in the flat style. And that was some artists from Oklahoma, occasionally some artists from New Mexico would come in and go to Bacone, which is in Northeast Oklahoma, and was a Native American school with a really robust program. And so she's definitely informed by the flat style.
And just my own follow-up, I noticed that you referred to the group as the Kiowa Five, which I know is the more traditional name.
It is, and I really should say the Kiowa Six. It is wrong to say Kiowa Five and leave out Lois Smoky. So I do thank you for that follow-up.
Okay, we have a question about asking why is it not cultural appropriation when a Native artist repurposes vintage quilts?
That's a good question. And so the idea of repurposing, and I think you see it in Gina Adams' work, as well as Marie, both of those artists take kind of found materials and turn them into something else. And so I think that it's a good question. I think depends on how the quilt is perceived. And I don't know the background of where she finds her quilts or where she gets her quilts. So that's a hard question for me to answer. But it is safe to say that if you take someone else's something that is homemade with love, that maybe turning it into something else could be an appropriation of culture. But I think that for Gina, and I hate to put words in an artist's mouth or answer for someone that isn't present, and she would probably have a really good answer for this, but I think that the way that she sees it is kind of a repurposing. And I go back to her ideas of the dichotomy between the language that she puts upon the quilts of the treaties and taking as kind of a hurtful thing, and the kind of warmth and wonderfulness of a quilt that we think of a way to get warm, and also of something that's handmade and often has historical significance for families or might be passed down. So it's hard for me to answer that question. It would be a question that would be great to pose to Gina.
I hate to disrupt this wonderful conversation that we're having about culture and everything like that. But I think since we're about 10 minutes over now, maybe just one more question, and then we have to go ahead and wrap and say goodbye. So
we do have a question here in the Q&A thread asking if you could explain what exactly is single thread beadwork.
Okay, so there's a lot of stitches in beadwork, and so single thread would be where you take it's a one needle technique, and so you have one thread and you're kind of individually sewing things down. And so a lot of times when you see something that's like referred to lane stitch, like the background of the piece by Jackie Larson Bread, you'll take a row of beads and you stitch them down, not every one is stitched. And so what single stitch allows you to do is create really intricate curvilinear patterns, and it allows you to kind of stitch that one at a time kind of bead down so that you can have that gradation and create those kind of wonderful pictorials.
Okay, so I think we'll have to make one exception because we did get a question from our former director, Bruce Hartman, and he is wondering if you could discuss the importance of including Native voices in museum labels.
I think it is really important. I think that as museums began to show more and more Native American art, particularly contemporary, and it's starting to expand beyond being something seen as ethnographic or anthropological, but is put into this art context. I think a Native voice makes sure that you maintain that perspective of what the artist's intent was, because I think that so much research and work needs to be done to write about Native American art, that to have that artist's voice inserted instead of just an outside kind of voice as a scholar, as an academic that may not know enough about the culture. And I know I struggle with this as someone that is a Native American that writes about Native American art. I don't always feel qualified to write about what the meaning is behind something. And so having that Native American voice is really, really important. Sometimes because tribes are so diverse, it's really important to reach out to communities and get those kind of inputs.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful, and we really appreciate your scholarship and your sharing your knowledge with us today. Thank you.
Well, I can't thank you enough. I really do appreciate it. Thanks so much.